I was 67 years old and $55 million richer after selling the company I had spent my life building. My family had never been prouder, or so they said. At the party I threw in my home to celebrate, a home filled with the ghosts of a happier time. My daughter-in-law Isabella slipped something into my wine glass, thinking I hadn't noticed. She was wrong. I smiled, and in the cheerful chaos of the toast, I swapped her father's glass with mine and watched him collapse just moments later. They thought it was a tragic accident. They had no idea it was an audition, and they had just gotten the part. Before I continue this story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to fight for your own dignity against people who are supposed to love you, hit that like button and subscribe, because this is just the beginning. The crystal glasses chimed with a sound so pure it felt like a lie. From my spot near the French doors overlooking the garden, I watched the heart of the party, a swirling constellation of expensive suits and silk dresses. This was my house, my victory, but I felt like a guest. The air, thick with the scent of roasted tenderloin and a dozen competing perfumes, was suffocating. For 40 years, this house had smelled like my wife Helen's lemon polish and the sawdust on my boots. Now, it smelled like money. My money. My son Leo was holding court near the fireplace, his hand resting on the marble mantle I'd installed myself. One grueling weekend in '98, he was retelling the story of the final negotiation for the sale of Caldwell Logistics. Only in his version, he was the hero who'd stared down the private equity vultures. I let him have the story. A man who needs to borrow glory has a debt no amount of money can pay. His wife, Isabella, glided through the room, a shark in a sapphire dress. Her smile never faltered, but her eyes were sharp, constantly scanning, assessing. She'd touch an investor's arm here, laugh at a CEO's bad joke there. She was building something, a network, a fortress. I had seen that look before, on the faces of people who view every relationship as a transaction, every kindness as a down payment. I sold the company because I was tired of the 4 a.m. wake-up calls, the union disputes, the razor-thin margins. After Helen passed 3 years ago, the fight had gone out of me. The business was just a machine I kept running out of habit. The 55 million wasn't for me, it was for them. A final, grand gesture, a chance to fix the distance that had grown between us since his mother was gone. A distance paved with Leo's bad investments and Isabella's insatiable hunger for a life she felt she was owed. I thought the money could be a bridge. I was a fool. An old man who still believed you could build things with cash instead of character. I needed a real drink, not the celebratory champagne that tasted like carbonated disappointment. My best scotch, a 25-year-old single malt, was in the study. I excused myself from a conversation about tax shelters and made my way down the hall. The door to the small library was ajar, the lights dimmed. I heard their voices before I saw them, hushed and sharp. Isabella's first, "This is our only chance. Leo, we are running out of time and options. After tonight, everything changes." I know. Leo's voice was thin, strained. But what if he says no? What if he puts it all in some trust for the grandkids? He won't. Isabella's voice was cold, certain. Not after what my father's plan will do to him. He'll be so confused, so vulnerable. He'll be begging you to take control. Just play your part. Be the devoted son. I froze, my hand on the study doorknob. It wasn't just greed. It was a plan, a coordinated attack. My own son, conspiring to break me, to make me pliable, so they could get their hands on the money. The warmth I'd felt from the scotch I was about to pour turned to ice in my veins. I backed away from the library door, my heart a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. I didn't feel rage. I felt an astonishing, terrifying clarity, the kind a man feels right before a car crash. I returned to the party a different man. The smiles now looked like masks. The friendly chatter sounded like coded threats. I saw Isabella across the room, watching me. She was holding a small, elegant clutch bag. I took my position near the head of the dining table, where the toast would happen, right next to her father, Marco Rossi. He was a big man, flawed-faced and loud, already on his third glass of my best Cabernet. He clapped me on the back. "Sam, my boy, you did it. Knew you had it in you." He smelled of wine and self-satisfaction. Then the call for the toast came. Glasses were refilled. A server placed a fresh, full glass of Chardonnay in front of me. Isabella moved through the crowd with the grace of a dancer. As she passed the table, She paused to straighten a napkin near my glass. Her clutch was open. I watched her hand, a blur of practiced motion. A tiny folded piece of paper, a quick tap, and a fine white powder disappeared into my wine. It dissolved instantly. She looked up and her eyes met mine. There was no fear in them, only triumph. The room began to quiet down. Leo was moving to the fireplace to start the speech. Everyone was looking at him. Everyone except me. I was looking at Marco. I coughed, a dry, rasping sound, and put my hand to my chest. "Marco," I gasped, lurching just slightly. "Water." He turned, his face a mask of mild annoyance. "You all right, Sam?" He was more concerned about his toast being delayed than my health. As he turned to signal a waiter, his arm brushed his own glass. It wobbled. My hand shot out, steadying it. "Careful there," I said, in that single, fluid motion. As his attention was diverted, my right hand, holding my own glass, swapped places with his. It took less than a second. A lifetime of working with my hands, of knowing angles and misdirection, paid off in that one silent, critical moment. He turned back, none the wiser. "Thanks," he grunted. Leo raised his glass. "To my father, Sam Caldwell," he began, his voice ringing with false emotion. "A man of vision, of grit, and a man who has secured our family's future. To Dad, to Dad." The room echoed. I raised my glass, Marco's glass, to my lips, but didn't drink. I watched over the rim as Marco, beaming with pride for his daughter's successful maneuvering, took a deep, satisfying swallow of his wine. Isabella was watching me, her smile a razor blade. It took about 2 minutes. Marco was in the middle of a loud, bragging story when his words began to slur. He paused, a confused look on his face. He put a hand to his forehead, then to his chest. His face, already ruddy, went a startling shade of pale grey. He stammered, his eyes wide with a terror that was not performative at all. He gasped, a wet, rattling sound, and then he collapsed, his large frame hitting the Persian rug with a sickening thud. The room erupted. People screamed. A woman dropped her glass, which shattered on the floor. Leo rushed forward, but I wasn't watching them. I was watching Isabella. Her face was a canvas of pure shock. Her eyes darted from her father's still form on the floor, not with worry, but to me, standing there, perfectly fine. Her mouth opened, and a single, strangled sound came out, and in her eyes, I saw it all. The fury, the confusion, the dawning horror that the wrong man had just fallen. The trap had been sprung, but the prey had just changed places with the hunter. The chaos of the next few minutes was a blur of sharp, disconnected sounds. A woman's scream, the crunch of shattered glass under someone's shoe. Leo's voice, tight with a panicky authority I hadn't heard since he was a teenager who'd crashed my car. The paramedics arrived with a professional calm that felt alien in the overheated room. They moved with an efficiency that made the party guests look like clumsy, useless statues. I watched them work on Marco, their voices a low, steady murmur of medical terms, vitals, arrhythmia, get me a line. I saw Isabella lean over them, her face a mask of frantic concern, a performance so flawless I almost admired it. She was pointing at me, her words a torrent. He was right next to him. He's been so confused since his wife died. Maybe he gave him the wrong pill. She was already writing the story, laying the track for the lie right there on the Persian rug, next to her father's unconscious body. I let them lead me to a chair. I let someone press a glass of water into my hand. I played the part they had cast me in, the shocked, frail old man, a step behind the action, a liability. It was the most difficult acting job of my life, and the most important. The hospital waiting room was a sterile, beige purgatory. The fluorescent lights hummed with an indifferent buzz, and the air smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. Leo paced the worn linoleum, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up in a way that looked artfully distressed. Isabella sat perfectly still, her phone in her hand, not scrolling, but holding it like a weapon in standby mode. She was texting, her thumbs moving with a furious, silent precision. She wasn't coordinating care. She was managing a crisis in public relations. Hours crawled by. Finally, a doctor with tired eyes and the weary posture of a man who delivers bad news for a living came through the double doors. "Mr. Rossi is stable," he announced, and a wave of performative relief washed over Leo and Isabella. "He had an acute cardiac event, an arrhythmia. His EKG is still showing some irregularities." He looked at his chart. "His blood work is unusual. The levels of his prescribed beta blocker, metoprolol, are dangerously high. It's as if he took 3 or 4 times his daily dose all at once. Isabella gasped, a perfectly pitched sound of horror. She put a hand to her mouth and turned to me, her eyes wide with manufactured dawning realization. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough. "Sam, Dad, you sometimes help Marco with his morning pills when he stays over, don't you? You lay them out for him on the counter." It was a masterstroke of cruelty, an accusation wrapped in a blanket of loving concern. She wasn't asking a question, she was planting a flag. The doctor's gaze shifted to me, a new, professional suspicion hardening his features. Leo stopped pacing and stared at me, his face a mess of confusion and dawning horror. I looked at my hands, letting them tremble just a little. I let my voice come out weak, fragmented. "I don't know," I said, looking up at them with what I hoped passed for a bewildered helplessness. I get his pillbox out for him sometimes. Everything has been such a blur since Helen passed." I let my voice crack on my wife's name. It wasn't hard. The grief was real. I was just using it as camouflage. The doctor gave me a look of professional pity. "It's all right, Mr. Caldwell. Mistakes happen." But the seed was planted. The narrative was set. Sam Caldwell, the grieving widower, confused, unreliable, a man who couldn't be trusted with something as simple as a pillbox. We were allowed to see Marco for a few minutes. He was pale against the white hospital sheets, hooked up to a symphony of beeping machines. He was awake, but groggy. He didn't remember what happened. That was a mercy, and a strategic advantage. On the silent drive back to my house, the tension in the car was thick enough to breathe. Finally, Leo broke it, his voice heavy with a manufactured sincerity. "Dad," he said, looking at me in the rearview mirror, "Isabella and we're worried about you." I didn't answer. I just stared out the window at the passing city lights. "You're all alone in that big house," he continued, the lines fed to him by the silent woman in the passenger seat. "After what happened tonight, maybe Isabella and I should stay with you for a while, just for a few weeks, to make sure you're okay, to help out." It was the move I had been waiting for, the Trojan horse they thought I would welcome with open arms, desperate for the company, for their care. The trap was closing, but they were the ones walking into it. I let out a long, weary sigh. "I don't want to be a burden," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Isabella finally turned, her face a perfect portrait of compassion. She placed her cool hand on my arm, the touch feeling less like comfort and more like a claim of ownership. "You're not a burden, Sam," she said, her voice like silk. "Your family. It's the least we can do." I nodded slowly, letting my shoulders slump in defeat. "Okay," I whispered, "if you think it's for the best." As we pulled into my driveway, I saw the satisfaction in her eyes, the quick, triumphant glance she shared with Leo. They thought they had won. They thought the old man had folded, that the keys to the kingdom were finally within their grasp. They moved in the next day with 6 suitcases and an agenda they thought was invisible. They had no idea that my own agenda had been set in motion long ago, and that the real game, the one played with lawyers and ledgers and the cold, hard truth of hidden cameras, was just about to begin. They thought they were taking over my house. They were about to find out they had just checked into a prison of their own making. The occupation was swift. I woke the first morning to a house that was no longer mine. The quiet, predictable landscape of my life had been redrawn overnight. My favorite leather armchair, the one with the worn spot on the left arm where I'd rested my elbow for 20 years, had been moved. It was no longer angled toward the fireplace, but pushed against the far wall, demoted to the status of extra seating. In its place sat a sleek, uncomfortable-looking grey sofa they must have brought with them. "Doesn't this just open up the room?" Isabella said, breezing past me with 2 mugs of what smelled like steamed kale. She didn't wait for an answer. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. On the mantelpiece, the large framed photograph of Helen and me, taken on our 35th anniversary, was gone. I found it relegated to a small end table in the corner, partially obscured by a stack of interior design magazines. In its place stood a single, sterile white orchid in a glass vase. "Less clutter," Isabella explained later with a brilliant, empty smile. "It creates a cleaner focal point." She was curating my memories, editing my life down to something that fit her aesthetic. The invasion continued in the kitchen. I went to make my usual breakfast: 2 eggs, over easy, with a side of bacon. Isabella intercepted me at the refrigerator. "Oh, no, Sam, not that. she said, her voice dripping with the kind of sweet concern that feels like a threat. She pulled a carton of eggs from my hand. Far too much cholesterol. I made you some steel-cut oats with flaxseed. It's much better for your heart. Before I could protest, she was throwing my bacon, my eggs, my butter into the trash. Most of this was expired anyway, she announced to the room. It's a good thing we're here to keep an eye on things. My phone calls became her property. The old landline, which I kept mostly for my friends from the fishing club, would ring, and she would answer it before I could move. "Oh, I'm so sorry. He's resting right now." She'd coo into the receiver. "I'll be sure to tell him you called." She never did. My old friend Bill called 3 times that first week. I didn't find out until he drove over himself, worried, only to be met at the door by Isabella, who explained with that same silken voice that I was easily overwhelmed these days, and they were managing my social calendar to ensure I got enough rest. It was a slow, methodical isolation, all done under the guise of care. Leo was her willing accomplice. He'd watch her rearrange my life, his face a mixture of guilt and relief. He was a man who had never wanted to be in charge, and he was grateful that his wife was so willing to take the wheel, even if it meant driving over his own father. Then came the paperwork. It started on the 3rd day. Isabella found me in the sunroom, reading the morning paper. She approached with a smile and a clipboard. "Sam, just a little thing to make our lives easier," she said, her voice bright. "This is just a mail forwarding authorization. It lets the post office send your important bills directly to my P.O. box. That way, I can handle paying them for you, and you won't have to worry about a thing." I looked at the form. It seemed simple enough, but it was a transfer of control, a small surrender. I squinted at the fine print. "Oh dear," I said, patting my pockets. "I seem to have misplaced my reading glasses. They're not in my shirt." It was a lie, of course. They were in my jacket, hanging in the closet. "I'll have to look for them later." She accepted it with a tight smile. "Of course, let me know when you find them." 2 days later, Leo approached me. He had been coached. I could see it in the way he held his shoulders, the way he avoided my eyes. "Dad," he said, holding out a different document. "Isabella and I were thinking, this is just a limited power of attorney. See," he pointed, "it's only for managing your utilities and paying your property taxes online. It would make things so much easier for us while we're helping out. You wouldn't have to deal with any of it." I took the paper and held it in my hands. The weight of it was immense. This was a bigger step, a bigger surrender. I let my gaze drift to the photo of Helen on the side table. "You know, son," I said, my voice soft with a grief that was both real and a useful shield. "Your mother, she always had David Chen look over anything with a signature line. Always. She'd say, 'Sam, our hands are for building. Let the lawyers handle the paper. It's just a habit, I suppose.'" I looked back at him. "Let me send a copy to David first, just to be safe." For Helen, he couldn't argue with that. To argue would be to disrespect his mother's memory, a line even he wasn't willing to cross in front of me. "Sure, Dad," he said, his relief palpable. "Whatever makes you comfortable." I could see the frustration simmering behind Isabella's calm facade. Her timeline was being disrupted. Her smile was a little tighter each day. The old man was proving more stubborn than she'd anticipated. I'd overhear her on the phone with her mother, her voice a low, frustrated hiss. "He's dragging his feet. Everything is a process with him. So sentimental." I continued my performance, the slightly forgetful, slightly frail man, leaning on the memory of his wife. Every time she presented a new former medical release, a bank account authorization, I had a new excuse. "My hand is too stiff to sign today. David is on vacation this week. I need to find the old files to compare." Each delay was a small victory, a quiet act of defiance. They thought they were managing me, but I was managing them, letting them reveal their intentions, their impatience, their greed, and all the while, the cameras in the walls, the tiny, unseen eyes, were recording every signature they tried to force, every lie they told, building a record of their care that would look very different in a court of law. One evening, I heard Isabella talking to Leo in the hallway, her voice too low for me to be meant to hear it, but just loud enough for me to catch. "He's being deliberately difficult," she seethed. "If you won't sign, Leo, we'll have to find another way to prove he needs our help." The threat hung in the air, a promise of the next front in their quiet war. And I knew, with a cold certainty, that the game was about to escalate. On Thursday morning, Isabella was in rare form. a symphony of performative care. She had laid out my clothes for me, a pair of pleated khaki pants I hadn't worn in a decade, and a polo shirt the color of a faded swimming pool. "For your doctor's appointment, Sam," she announced, placing my pillbox next to my car keys on the hall table. "Don't forget to have them give you a printout of your vitals. It's important we have a baseline." She wanted a paper trail of my decline. I smiled my weary compliant smile and told her it was a good idea. I didn't drive to my doctor's office. I drove downtown, to a high-rise building of glass and steel, where the air itself seemed to have a higher thread count. The law offices of Chen and Associates were on the 34th floor, a quiet world of dark wood, old leather, and the hushed, reassuring smell of trust. David Chen wasn't just my lawyer. He was a friend I'd known since we were both young men trying to make a name for ourselves in a city that didn't give away anything for free. He stood when I walked in, his handshake firm, his eyes missing nothing. "How's the occupation going, Sam?" he asked, foregoing any small talk. "She's redecorating," I said, sinking into the familiar leather of the client chair. "And she thinks my reading glasses are on an extended vacation." A thin smile touched his lips. "Let her keep looking." He turned to the large monitor on his desk and clicked a mouse. "I reviewed the footage you uploaded this morning. From the party." The screen came to life. It was a high-definition video feed from a camera I'd had installed 2 months ago, perfectly disguised as a smoke detector above the dining room table. The angle was perfect. I watched the scene unfold again, this time in cold, digital clarity. Isabella, the clutch bag, the tiny folded paper, the quick, almost invisible tap of powder into my wineglass. "Clear shot," David said, his voice a low, satisfied hum. "Facial recognition is positive. The timestamp is embedded. We have her, Sam, we have her cold." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "So why are we waiting?" I asked. "Why not just show this to the police and end it?" David swiveled in his chair to face me, his expression serious. "Because this was never just about the poisoning. That was an act of desperation. Our goal is bigger. We let her continue. We let her believe you're weak. We let her try to get you to sign papers. We let her try to have you declared incompetent. Every move she makes now, Sam, she makes inside a cage she can't see. When this is over, the district attorney won't see one reckless act at a party. He'll see a clear, documented pattern of conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse. We're not just catching a criminal, my friend. We're dismantling a machine." I looked at the screen, at the frozen image of my daughter-in-law, in the act of trying to destroy me, and I finally understood. My patience wasn't weakness, it was a weapon. Every day I endured her condescension, every form I refused to sign, every quiet observation I made was another bar in the cage. "The sale of the company was the perfect bait," I said, more to myself than to him. $55 million, David agreed, a glint in his eye. "It makes people very careless. They get so focused on the prize, they stop looking for the trap." He was right. My life's work, the company I'd poured my blood and sweat into, had one last job to do. It was going to buy me justice. David stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city below. "Go home, Sam," he said. "Keep playing the part. Be the grieving widower. Be the confused old man. Let them think they're winning. Their confidence will make them sloppy, and we'll be there to catch every mistake." I left his office feeling a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. The city outside didn't look so menacing anymore. It just looked like a board, a very large, complicated chessboard. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just a pawn. I was the one deciding the next move. Isabella's frustration was a low, simmering heat in the house. My polite refusals, my misplaced glasses, my insistence on waiting for David's approval, they were grit in the gears of her well-oiled machine. After a week of this, she decided it was time to bring in a professional. "Sam, darling," she announced one morning at the breakfast table, her voice bright and brittle. "I've arranged for a wonderful woman to come chat with you this afternoon. A geriatric care manager. She just helps families like ours create a roadmap for the future, to understand your needs better." Leo, standing behind her, nodded in agreement, his eyes fixed on his coffee cup. They weren't asking, they were informing. This wasn't a chat, it was an ambush, but it was an ambush I had been preparing for. David had warned me this would be her next move. She'd try to get a third party to declare you incompetent. "Sam," he'd said, "it gives her leverage. It makes her look like the responsible one." He'd walked me through the likely questions, the psychological triggers, the specific financial details they use to trip people up. Ms. Albright arrived at 2 o'clock. She was a neat, professional woman in her 50s with kind but perceptive eyes. Isabella ushered her into the living room, hovering like a vulture disguised as a hummingbird. "He has good days and bad days," Isabella whispered to her, just loud enough for me to hear. "The grief, you know, it comes in waves." I played my part. I appeared a little slow, a little folksy. Ms. Albright began with simple questions: the date, the president, the name of the city we were in. I answered them correctly, but with a slight hesitation, as if pulling the information from a dusty shelf. Then she moved to finances. "Mr. Caldwell, do you manage your own bank accounts?" "Oh, mostly," I said with a wave of my hand. "Though Isabella here has been so helpful since she and Leo arrived," Isabella preened, "he sometimes forgets to pay bills, so we've been assisting." "I see," Ms. Albright said, making a note. She then turned back to me. "Can you tell me, roughly, what the interest rate is on a standard 10-year Treasury bond right now?" Isabella's smile faltered. It was a specific, technical question, the kind a confused old man would fumble. I looked at the ceiling for a moment as if in thought. "Well," I said slowly, "as of yesterday's close, it was hovering around 4.12%. It's been volatile." I moved a portion of Helen's old portfolio into a series of shorter-term CDs last month to hedge against it. The return is lower, but the principal is protected. David Chen, my lawyer, agreed it was the most prudent course of action. The room went silent. Ms. Albright's pen stopped moving. She looked from my face to Isabella's, whose smile had frozen solid. The assessment continued for another 30 minutes, but the battle was already over. I answered every question with the same quiet, detailed precision. I recalled the exact date of my last property tax payment, explained the copay structure of my Medicare Part D plan, and even named the plumber who had fixed a leaky pipe in 2018. Finally, Ms. Albright closed her notebook. She turned to Isabella, her professional expression unwavering. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, her voice clear and firm, "your father-in-law is one of the most cognitively sound and financially astute individuals I have had the pleasure of assessing. My report will state, unequivocally, that he is fully competent to manage all of his own affairs." "Wonderful," Isabella chirped, the sound high and thin. "We are so relieved." That night, the hidden microphone in the living room lamp paid its first dividend. I sat in my study, the audio feed playing softly through my computer speakers. Their voices were venomous whispers. "That was a disaster," Isabella hissed. "The old fool played us. He was prepared. He knew what she was going to ask. So what do we do now?" Leo's voice was frayed with panic. "He's never going to sign anything. David Chen has him completely walled off." There was a long pause. I could hear the clink of a glass being set down hard on a coaster. "The easy way is over. Leo," Isabella's voice was flat, cold, and deadly serious. "We have to force his hand. We have to make him feel like he has no other choice. It's time to call your investors. Tell them the timeline has just been moved up." The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological warfare, all of it disguised as loving care. Isabella was relentlessly cheerful, a smiling warden in my own home. She brought me tea I didn't want, fluffed pillows I wasn't sitting on, and filled the house with the scent of lavender potpourri that smelled like a funeral home's air freshener. Leo, on the other hand, was a ghost. He drifted through rooms with his shoulders hunched, his eyes shadowed with a guilt that was either real or an excellent performance. They were setting the stage, creating an atmosphere of tension and crisis, preparing for their next move. It came on a Saturday afternoon. The sky outside was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the kind of day Helen and I would have spent in the garden. I was in my armchair, pretending to read a book, when the doorbell rang. It wasn't the gentle chime of a neighbor. It was a sharp, insistent jab, the sound of impatience. Isabella, who had been arranging flowers on the mantel, went still. Leo looked up from his laptop, his face pale. "Are you expecting someone?" Isabella asked, her voice a little too high. I shook my head, playing my part. "No, not at all." She went to the door and opened it a few inches. 2 men stood on my porch. They were large, dressed in dark suits that were a little too tight in the shoulders, a little too shiny in the sun. They didn't look like they belonged in our quiet, suburban neighborhood. One was broad and silent, with a shaved head and a neck as thick as a fence post. The other was smaller, leaner, with a predatory smile that didn't touch his cold, empty eyes. "We're here to see Leo Caldwell," the smaller man said, his voice smooth and low. Isabella feigned surprise. "I'm sorry, who's asking?" The man's smile widened. "Tell him his investors are here, Mr. Slate and Mr. Jones. We have an appointment." She let them in, her movements stiff with practiced fear. Leo shot up from his chair as they entered the living room. The silent one, Jones, stood by the door, his arms crossed, blocking the exit. Slate walked to the center of the rug and looked around, his gaze lingering on the expensive art on the walls, on the grand piano in the corner. "Leo," Slate said, his voice dangerously soft. "We had an arrangement, a significant capital investment. You made us some promises." Leo was trembling now, a fine tremor running through his hands. I know, Mr. Slate. The deal. It just needs a little more time." The market shifted. The market didn't shift. "Leo," Slate cut him off. "Your competence did. Returns have not materialized. Our patience has. We're here to discuss collateral." This was it. The performance, and I had to admit, they were convincing. I stayed in my armchair, letting my book fall into my lap, my face a mask of bewildered fear. My heart was a slow, steady drum. I saw the cheap polyester blend of their suits, the scuff marks on their rented-looking shoes. I saw the way the silent one kept glancing at the street, a telltale sign of an actor who is more concerned with his getaway car than the scene he's in. The hidden camera in the bookshelf was capturing it all in beautiful, damning clarity. Isabella stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Leo's arm. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "Not here. He's not well. He doesn't understand these things." Slate's cold eyes swiveled to me. He took a slow step closer, and I made myself shrink back into the cushions of my chair. "Oh, I think he'll understand this," he said. "Your son made us promises, Mr. Caldwell. Promises based on his future prospects." His eyes swept the room again, a clear reference to my wealth. "We hear you've recently come into a significant sum. 55 million, I believe the papers said. In our world, that doesn't just make you a proud father, it makes you a guarantor. This has become a family debt." I looked at Leo, widening my eyes, letting my mouth fall open slightly. "Leo," I whispered, my voice a dry, reedy sound. "What have you done?" He couldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the floor. "Dad, I'm so sorry," he mumbled. "I thought the deal was solid. I was trying to make something of myself. It was perfect. The broken son, the terrified wife, the menacing investors. All that was missing was the frail old man reaching for his checkbook to save the day." "We need a payment plan, Mr. Caldwell," Slate said, his voice hardening. "A concrete one. By the end of the week, or we begin the process of asset seizure. Your son here can sign over the necessary authority to his accounts. Or," he paused, letting his gaze rest on me, "you can cliff." He let the threat hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. Then he and his silent partner turned and walked out of the house as smoothly as they had entered. The moment the door clicked shut, Isabella rushed to my side, collapsing onto the ottoman at my feet. She took my hand, her own trembling for effect. "Sam, oh, Sam, what are we going to do?" she cried, tears welling in her eyes. "You have to help him. You have to sign the papers and give Leo control. It's the only way to protect him." I looked down at her, at my son, who was still frozen by the fireplace, at the empty space where the cheap actors had stood, and I felt nothing but a cold, surgical calm. They thought they had me cornered. They thought they had finally found the key to unlock my fortune. They had no idea they had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to lock them away for good. The heavy front door clicked shut, sealing the threat inside with us. The silence the two men left behind was louder than their words. It was a vacuum, pulling all the air out of the room. Leo was the first to break. He sank onto the grey sofa, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. It was a convincing portrayal of a man shattered by his own mistakes. Isabella, however, moved with the sharp, focused energy of a field surgeon at a disaster site. She knelt before me, her carefully constructed mask of terror replaced by one of urgent, fierce sincerity. She gripped my hands, her fingers cold and strong. "Sam, did you hear them?" she said, her voice a frantic whisper. "Asset seizure. They know about the sale. They will take everything. Everything you and Helen worked for. The house, the savings, all of it. They won't stop until they've picked us clean." I let my own hands tremble in hers. I stared at my son's shaking form, my face a canvas of fatherly anguish. "But it was his deal," I stammered. "How can they come after me?" "It doesn't matter. she insisted, her eyes boring into mine. They see the 55 million as one big pot. They'll tie it all up in court for years. They will bleed us dry with legal fees. Unless we protect it. Unless we move faster than they do. I was a fish on a line, and she was expertly reeling me in. The camera hidden in the ceramic lamp on the end table was recording her flawless performance. Protect it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. How? Leo looked up then, his face slick with what looked like real tears. Dad, they'll ruin us. They'll ruin you, he choked out. I'm so sorry. I never should have. Please, you have to help me. You have to let me fix this. This was their closing argument. The pincer movement of his emotional collapse and her cold, clear-eyed logic. Isabella rose and went to the heavy oak sideboard, pulling out a thick, leather-bound binder. She placed it on the coffee table in front of me with a soft, definitive thud. Our lawyer prepared this, she said, her voice dropping to a confidential, reassuring tone. It's the only way, Sam. It's a full, durable power of attorney. She opened the binder. Inside were dozens of pages of dense legal text, with neat, yellow arrow stickers pointing to signature lines. If you sign this, you grant Leo the legal authority to act on your behalf. He can immediately move the funds from the sale into a new corporate trust, a shell that they can't touch. He can go to them and negotiate a settlement from a position of strength. But he has no power to do any of that, Sam, unless you give it to him. Right now, today. I stared at the papers, my eyes wide with confusion. Power of attorney, I said, letting the words sound foreign and terrifying. But that means he would control everything. It's not about control, Dad, Leo pleaded, crawling forward on the sofa. It's about protection. To protect what's ours. What's yours, please, don't you see? This is the only way I can save our family. I looked from my son's desperate face to my daughter-in-law's earnest, pleading expression. It was a perfect trap, built from love and fear. They were offering me the chance to be the hero, to be the father who swoops in and saves his child from a terrible mistake. They were counting on my history of rescuing him, on the muscle memory of a father's love. My inner voice was cold and steady. Amateurs, I thought. They didn't even think to use a real law firm's letterhead, just a generic template from the internet. I let a long, shuddering breath out. I looked at the signature page, at the crisp black line where my name was supposed to go. I looked at Leo. Then I picked up the heavy, expansive-looking pen Isabella had placed so thoughtfully beside the binder. My hand shook as I uncapped it. I saw it in their eyes, a flash of pure, undiluted triumph. A current of victory passed between them, so quick and quiet I would have missed it if I hadn't been looking for it. They thought they had me. The final lock was about to click into place. I leaned forward, the pen hovering just above the paper. The tip trembled. Okay, I whispered. Okay, son, if this is what it takes. And then I stopped. I let the pen fall from my fingers. It clattered onto the table. I pressed my hands to my temples, my whole body seeming to shake. Wait, I said, my voice cracking with a sudden, new wave of what looked like panicked grief. Wait, Helen. They both froze. The name of my dead wife was a holy thing in this house, a name they had used as a tool but never expected me to wield as a shield. What is it, Sam? Isabella asked, her voice tight with impatience. She made me promise, I whispered, looking at them with wide, tear-filled eyes. After my first heart scare, we were sitting right here, in this room. She took my hand and said, Sam, if anything ever happens to me, you promise me, you never sign anything important, anything about money or the house, without having David Chen look at it first, I promised her. I looked down at the documents, then back at them, my face a portrait of a man torn between two sacred duties. I can't, I said, my voice breaking. I can't break a promise to her, not to Helen. Just let me call David, let me ask him. For her, the air in the room went still. They were trapped. To argue against my promise to my dying wife would be to reveal their monstrousness. To deny me a call to my lawyer would be an admission of deceit. Leo broke first, his panic overriding Isabella's strategy. Fine, he snapped, his voice high and strained. Call him right now. But he'd better tell you to sign, Dad, because you heard them. We are out of time. My hand was steady as I picked up my phone. The weight of it felt different now, not a lifeline, but a tool. Isabella and Leo watched me, their faces a mixture of suspicion and impatience. The air in the living room was thick with their expectations, so thick I could almost taste the metallic tang of their greed. What are you doing? Isabella demanded, her voice sharp. "We don't have time for this, Sam. You need to sign those papers." I ignored her. I looked at my son, at the panic swimming in his eyes, and I felt a pang of something ancient and sad. A father's grief for a son who had lost his way. Then I remembered the cold water of the lake, his mother's name on Isabella's lips, and the feeling hardened into resolve. I dialed the number David and I had agreed upon. "David," I said, my voice calm and clear. "It's Sam. Yes, it's time. Could you come over? And please, bring our Ways business associates. I believe their consultation is required." Leo's head snapped up. "Business associates? What are you talking about, Dad? Who did you call?" "Just a formality, son," I said, meeting his gaze. Something Helen would have insisted on. I gave the phone a final, decisive tap and placed it face down on the table. Then I waited. The 5 minutes that followed were the longest of their lives. For me, it was the final, satisfying breath before a dive. Leo paced. Isabella stood by the window, her arms crossed, her perfect posture screaming with tension. The doorbell rang. Not the sharp jab of their hired actors, but a calm, polite chime. "I'll get it," Leo said, practically lunging for the door, desperate to control something, anything. He opened it to find David Chun standing on the porch, his face serene, his hands clasped behind his back. But he wasn't alone. Standing on either side of him were the 2 men from the day before, Mr. Slate and Mr. Jones, the investors. Isabella's breath hitched. A flicker of pure fury crossed her face before she could mask it. "What is the meaning of this?" she hissed. "What are they doing here?" David stepped inside, followed by the 2 men, who closed the door behind them with a soft, final click. And in that moment, I changed. I stood up from my armchair, not like a frail old man, but like the man who had built a logistics empire from nothing. The tremble left my voice, my shoulders straightened. A lifetime of quiet observation had finally found its purpose. "They're here because I hired them," I said, my voice resonating in the sudden, dead silence of the room. Isabella stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. "They're not investors," I continued, letting each word land like a carefully placed stone. "They are private investigators, and they have been on my payroll for the last 6 months. The color drained from her face. Leo looked back and forth between me and the 2 men, his mind struggling to process the shift in the script. The first domino had fallen. "I've known about your AI tech venture for almost a year, son," I said, turning to Leo. His face crumpled. "I know it was a fraudulent shell company. I know you lost every penny you borrowed from those real investors in Chicago. And I know," I said, turning my gaze to Isabella, whose face was now a mask of cold fury, "that you have been using that debt to blackmail my son, pushing him, coaching him, forcing him toward this exact moment. You wanted the 55 million, I said to her. You smelled it like blood in the water. You and your father cooked up a plan to have me declared incompetent after a convenient medical episode so you could seize control. The party, the toast, it was all a stage." She tried to find her voice, to regain control. "This is insane," she sputtered. "You're the one who's confused. You tried to poison my father." "No," I said, my voice dropping, becoming as cold and clear as ice. "You did, and you just couldn't stand the thought that all your careful planning resulted in poisoning the wrong man." I then looked at both of them, two predators caught in a trap they didn't even know existed. "And as for the money, the reason I've been so patient with this little performance of yours," I let the pause stretch, savoring the dawning horror in their eyes. "The thing is, Isabella, there is no $55 million pot of gold, not for you." I saw the confusion war with disbelief on her face. "The moment the sale of Caldwell Logistics was finalized," I explained, gesturing toward my lawyer. "David here executed my instructions. Every last cent, minus a modest living stipend for myself, was transferred into a series of irrevocable charitable trusts. They are named after my late wife: the Helen Caldwell Foundation for the Arts, the Helen Caldwell Children's Literacy Fund." I let the names settle in the air, a monument to a woman whose memory they had tried to weaponize. "The money is untouchable. By you, by Leo, even by me. It will spend the next century funding scholarships and building libraries. There is nothing for you to steal." If I had struck her, the effect could not have been more profound. Her face, which had been a tightly controlled mask of elegance, simply collapsed. The confidence evaporated. replaced by a raw, primal rage. "You're lying," she shrieked, her voice stripped of its silken polish. "It's a trick," Izukai said softly. I picked up the small, discreet remote from the coffee table. "I've made a few upgrades to the house recently. For security, I aimed it at the large, dark screen of the television mounted above the fireplace. Let's review the minutes from our last meeting, shall we?" The screen flickered to life. The image was crystal clear, the audio sharp. It was the party, the sound of laughter, of clinking glasses. And then, the camera's view zoomed slightly, focusing on the table. On my wineglass, on Isabella's hand as she moved past, her clutch open, and the tiny, folded paper. On the fine white powder, invisibly dissolving into the Chardonnay. The room was utterly silent, save for the sounds from the television. Leo made a small, strangled noise in his throat. I narrated over the silent footage, my voice devoid of emotion. "Was this your father's plan, Isabella? Was this the part where I clutch my chest and collapse, just like he did? The part where the grieving, confused old man suffers a medical episode, and his loving, responsible children have no choice but to take control of his affairs?" I paused the video on a perfect, damning close-up of her triumphant smile. "Just after the deed was done. The problem is, you poisoned the wrong glass, and you did it on camera." She stared at the screen, her face ashen. The trap was sprung. The cage was locked. There was no escape. Mr. Slate and Mr. Jones, my investigators, had been standing silently by the door. Now, Slate spoke into the small microphone on his cuff. "We're ready." As if on cue, the front door opened. The investigators stepped aside. 2 uniformed police officers from the local precinct stood on the threshold, their faces grim and professional. The theater was over. Reality had arrived. One of the officers stepped forward, his eyes fixed on my daughter Runala. Her name, when he said it, sounded like a final judgment. "Isabella Caldwell, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Samuel Caldwell." The click of the handcuffs, as they closed around her wrists, was the only sound in the room. It was a small, metallic sound, the sound of a story ending, the sound of a debt being paid in full. The click of the handcuffs was a small, dry sound in the suddenly cavernous living room. It was the sound of a period at the end of a very long, very ugly sentence. Isabella went rigid. For a single, breathless moment, she simply stared at the officer as if he were speaking a language she refused to understand. The shock on her face was absolute, a perfect porcelain mask, cracking in real time. Then the fury came. "Get your hands off me," she snarled. Her voice, a low, venomous thing I'd never heard before. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Leo." She twisted, her eyes locking on her husband, the command sharp and reflexive. "Leo, do something." But Leo wasn't doing anything. He was staring at the television screen, where the paused image of his wife poisoning my drink was still displayed like a grotesque family portrait. His face was slack, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a man who had just walked through a door and found himself in a completely different country. He didn't even seem to hear her. The officers were professional, unmoved. They guided Isabella toward the door with a firm, practiced grip. She fought for a moment, a brief, undignified struggle that made the sapphire dress look cheap. "You will regret this, Sam," she screamed over her shoulder, her eyes finally finding me. They were filled with a pure, black hatred. "I will burn you to the ground for this." The front door opened, and the cool night air rushed in. I saw the flash of cameras from the street reporters David must have tipped off. The public humiliation she had so carefully designed for me was now her own. The door clicked shut, and she was gone. The silence she left behind was absolute. It was in that silence that Leo finally broke. He made a sound, a raw, guttural noise from deep in his chest, and then he simply folded. He crumpled to the floor, landing on his knees on the expensive rug, his hands covering his face as great, racking sobs tore through his body. He wasn't acting now. This was real. This was the unfiltered agony of a weak man whose entire world had just been detonated before his eyes. I stood there, watching my son fall apart, and felt nothing but a profound and terrible sadness. Davy Chun placed a quiet hand on my shoulder. His own phone had begun to buzz relentlessly, a low, angry vibration against the polished wood of the side table. He glanced at the screen. "It's starting," he said, his voice grim. "The wire services have the story. Your old board members are calling. Investors Leo scammed in Chicago. Their lawyers are calling." This shockwave was already expanding, a circle of consequence spreading out from this room. One of my investigators, Slate, stepped forward. His demeanor was all business now, the cheap theatrics gone. "Sir," he said to me, "we have a team at the hospital ready to inform Mr. Russi." I nodded, my throat tight. Marco, a man of bluster and pride, a man who looked down on me. He was about to learn that his own daughter had not only tried to murder me, but had almost killed him by mistake. He wasn't a partner in her scheme. He was collateral damage, a pawn she had been willing to sacrifice. The call from the hospital came 20 minutes later. David took it, listening intently, his face grim. He hung up and turned to me. The investigator just spoke with him. He showed him a portion of the video. David paused, choosing his words carefully. "He's not taking it well. But he's talking. He's giving a full statement." David took a deep breath. "And Sam, there's more. Marco just confirmed it. Isabella came to him last month. She said she was researching dosage interactions for a friend with a heart condition. She asked for a few of his metoprolol pills. He thought she was being thoughtful. He gave them to her. You'll find a nail. It wasn't just a random powder. It was premeditated, sourced from her own father, a final, sickening act of betrayal that sealed her fate." I walked to the French doors and looked out into the darkness. The party lights were still twinkling in the garden, casting a festive, mocking glow on the empty chairs. The whole world had changed in the space of an hour. My son was a broken man kneeling in my living room. My daughter-in-law was in the back of a police car, her name a brand of poison. And I was left standing in the wreckage. David's voice was quiet beside me. "You did the right thing, Sam." "Did I?" I asked, my voice hoarse. I looked at the reflection of the room in the dark glass. It looked like a battlefield after the fighting was over. There were no winners here. There were only survivors. And in that moment, I realized the cost of this victory was a part of my own heart. The part that had stubbornly, foolishly, believed that the boy I had raised was still in there somewhere. Today, I had been forced to accept that he was gone for good. The weeks following Isabella's arrest were a quiet, brutal avalanche for my son. The business associates and fair-weather friends who had once clapped him on the back at the country club now crossed the street to avoid him. The real investors, the ones he had defrauded in Chicago, filed a lawsuit that froze what little he had left. The bank, no longer placated by the promise of my $55 million safety net, called in his loans. I watched from a distance. Through the quiet updates I received from David, first, the glossy black BMW was repossessed. Then the foreclosure notices were posted on the heavy oak door of the house I had helped him buy. He and Isabella had built a life that was a beautiful, hollow facade. And now, without my money to prop it up, it was collapsing in on itself. I gave it a month for the shock to wear off and the hard reality to set in. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, I drove to the address David had given me. It was a small, dingy apartment complex on the industrial side of town, wedged between a self-storage facility and a freeway overpass. The paint was peeling, and a few windows were cracked. It was a world away from the manicured lawns and gated communities he was used to. He answered the door after the third knock. He looked diminished. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a wrinkled t-shirt and worn jeans. He hadn't shaved in days, and there were dark circles under his eyes. The golden boy polish had been stripped away, leaving behind a man I barely recognized, a man who looked lost and brittle. The apartment behind him was sparse and sad. A mattress on the floor in one corner, a pile of cardboard boxes in another. It smelled of stale pizza and despair. He didn't invite me in, just stood in the doorway, blocking the path. I held up a small paper bag of groceries I'd brought. Good coffee, fresh bread, a block of cheese, simple things, real things. "Thought you might need this," I said. He stared at the bag for a long moment before taking it, his fingers brushing mine. He didn't say thank you. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with a toxic mixture of resentment and a desperate, childlike plea. Finally, he found his voice. "Why?" he asked, the word cracking. "Why did you do it, Dad? You could have just paid them. You could have fixed it. You had the money. Why did you let it all burn down?" It was the question of a man who still believed my life's purpose was to be his personal firefighter, to exist solely to extinguish the blazes he started. I looked at him, my own son, standing in the ruins of a life he hadn't built, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to rescue him. I felt the grim necessity of the truth. Paid him with what, Leo? I asked, my voice quiet but unyielding. With the money your wife tried to kill me for? I spent your entire life paying for things. Your tuition, your cars, your business, ideas, your mistakes. I built a soft landing for you at every turn. And what did it create? It created a man who stood by silently while his wife plotted to destroy his own father. It created a man who crumbled the second the safety net was gone. He flinched, but I wasn't finished. I had to let you hit the bottom, son. The bottom you built for yourself, brick by brick. Because that's the only place you can find a solid foundation. That's the only way you might learn how to build something real, something that's actually yours. He just stared at me, the fight draining out of him, leaving only a hollow emptiness. He had no more arguments, no more borrowed confidence. I reached into my jacket pocket, but it wasn't my wallet I pulled out. It was a single, crisp business card. I held it out to him. This isn't money, I said, placing it on the rickety table by the door. It's a map. Her name is Maria Sanchez. She's a career counselor. She doesn't work with CEOs or venture capitalists. She helps people who have lost their way figure out what their hands are good for, besides holding out for a handout. He looked at the card as if it were a foreign object. When you're ready to actually work, I said, my voice softening just a fraction. When you're ready to build something that doesn't require my signature, you call her. I turned and walked away without another word. I didn't look back. As I reached my car, I could feel his eyes on me, watching from the doorway of his new, smaller life. He had a choice now. He could stay there, drowning in his resentment, or he could pick up that card and start the long, hard climb out of the hole he was in. For the first time, the outcome was entirely, irrevocably his. 6 months passed. The seasons turned, and with them, the landscape of all our lives. The world moves on, whether you're ready for it or not. I learned that the hard way after Helen died, and I was learning it again now. But this time, the lesson felt less like a punishment and more like a quiet truth. I spend most of my days on a small boat in the middle of a quiet lake a few hours, north of the city. I'd bought a little cabin there, a simple place with a porch that faced the water and a fireplace that drew well. The $55 million, Helen's money, as I now thought of it, was at work. David sent me the quarterly reports from the charitable trusts. The Helen Caldwell Foundation for the Arts had fully funded a youth music program in an underserved school district. The Children's Literacy Fund had just broken ground on a new wing for the public library. The money, which had been the source of so much poison, was finally being used as an antidote. That felt more real than any number in a ledger. The legal process for Isabella was a slow, grinding machine that I no longer tracked daily. David handled it, sending me brief, professional updates, depositions, motions, continuances. Her name was a ghost in a world of paperwork, a world that felt 1,000 miles away from the gentle rocking of my boat and the call of the loons. Across the water, I heard about Leo in fragments. David told me he had taken the job with the career counselor's help, something in a logistics warehouse, honest work. The hours were long, the pay was a fraction of what he used to spend on a single dinner, but it was his. I didn't call him. The old impulse to check on him, to fix things, was still there, a faint echo in my bones, but I had made a promise to myself to let him stand or fall on his own. One afternoon, while I was cleaning a small bass I'd caught, a letter arrived from the local post office. The envelope was plain, my name and address written in a familiar, but hesitant hand. It was from Leo. I carried it out to the dock and sat there for a long time, the letter unopened in my hand, watching the sun dip below the pine trees. I wasn't sure I was ready to read it. I was afraid of what I might find inside. A request, an accusation, a blame-filled rant. Finally, I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of cheap notebook paper. It wasn't long. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic declarations. It was something quieter and far more powerful. Dad, it began. The foreman at the warehouse says, I'm learning. He says my hands are slow, but my back is strong. The pay isn't much, but it's enough. I paid my rent on Friday. All of it. It was the first time in more than a decade I did that without a loan or a lie. The electricity bill is due next week. I have the money for it set aside in an envelope. I'm eating a lot of rice and beans, but it's food I paid for. It tastes different. I had to stop reading for a moment, my throat thick. I looked out at the water, at the last rays of sunlight, painting the surface in strokes of gold and orange. I read the final lines. I know I have a long way to go. I know I can't undo what I did, what I let happen. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying. There was a postscript at the very bottom, a single sentence that hit me with the force of a physical blow. I hope that one day I can treat you to a meal. I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope, my hands trembling slightly. I held it to my chest and leaned back against the warm wood of the dock. The tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed in months finally came. Not tears of grief, but of a strange, painful, and profound release. And in that quiet moment, with the water lapping gently against the pilings and the first stars beginning to appear in the twilight sky, I understood. True wealth was never the $55 million. It was this, the quiet of an autumn evening, the freedom to protect what was right, the profound peace that comes from living a life of dignity. I had won, not by destroying them, but by stripping away their illusions and forcing them, finally, after all these years, to face the truth of who they really were. And in the process, in the long, painful silence, I had found my way back to myself. I picked up my fishing rod, reeled in the line, and felt the simple, satisfying weight of it in my hand. The war was over. It was time to just be a man, on a boat, on a quiet lake, waiting to see what tomorrow's tide would bring. This story teaches that respect within a family must be earned, not assumed. True strength isn't about endless patience, but about setting firm boundaries. When kindness is treated as weakness, taking decisive action to protect your dignity is the only way to reclaim peace and teach necessary lessons. Share your thoughts on the father's final decision in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice and reclaimed dignity, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more. Thank you.